There are a lot of people here who are going to be talking about particular foreign policy issues, so I thought I would lead off by making some more general comments about likely foreign policy strategies under a Trump administration. But let me begin with a pithy characterization of Mr. Trump that was given by Selena Zito in a piece that she wrote in September Atlantic. She said, the press takes Mr. Trump literally but not seriously, and his supporters take him seriously but not literally. And I think that that's actually good advice for all of us at this juncture, because I think some of the things that Mr. Trump said during the campaign, he's obviously already started to walk back on. And so the general impulse to, for example, do something on trade, do something about the alliances may still be there, but exactly how that's done is still to be seen. The second cliche I want to use, which I think is correct, is that personnel is policy. And to date, we really only have two appointments that deal directly with what I would call foreign policy. Jeff Sessions is sometimes put in that camp because his stances are important with respect to immigration, but we have Michael Flynn as the National Security Advisor and Mike Pompeo at CIA. Both of those suggest that Mr. Trump will be preoccupied with issues in the Middle East and with Islamic fundamentalism, as he's wont to call it in particular. How that plays out, though, I think we're already having the first crisis of a Trump presidency, because the day after he had his conversation with Mr. Putin last week, the Russians announced a bombing campaign in Syria, which was supposedly aimed at Islamic fundamentalist groups, but in fact ended up sweeping up civilians in Aleppo and opposition forces, which the United States is maintaining, so seeking to support. So there's going to be a question of whether he's drawn back to a more bipartisan kind of foreign policy that some of us suspect he might, or whether he'll sustain his somewhat more idiosyncratic views. So in that regard, let me just emphasize that you wouldn't know it from this campaign, but actually American foreign policy does have some very strongly bipartisan components to it. And those include maintenance of a substantial military primacy, particularly with respect to the Navy and control of the seas, support for the alliances, mainly for balancing purposes against Russia and China, and support for an open world economy. And I think, as we've all seen, one of the questions of a Trump presidency is the extent to which he'll be pulled back to those core elements of a bipartisan foreign policy, or whether he'll pursue these other views. So what do we have to go on? We actually don't have that much to go on. Mr. Trump made one, I would call, substantive speech on foreign policy and national security issues during the campaign in September in Philadelphia. It's a serious speech. It contains a substantial critique of the Clinton foreign policy, but its main message was that the U.S. foreign policy should pursue a strategy of peace through strength. But what I don't think has been fully appreciated is exactly how much strength Mr. Trump thought the United States should be buying. And in fact, this is a major military buildup, which he has promised. And what's interesting are the components of it as well. It's not just the Army, an increase in troop strength of about 50,000, which is roughly 10%, or in the Marines, but a very substantial increase in our naval capabilities, about 85 surface vessels and submarines. Now, I think there are two issues with this strategy. First of all is whether he can actually get it through, because it conflicts directly, as Sam said, with some of the fiscal hawks on the Hill. How will this be funded? How will this be funded in the context of making commitments with respect to infrastructure as well? But then I think even more puzzling is the question of how such forces would actually be used, because Mr. Trump also has this non-interventionist streak, and so presumably this buildup would be for the purpose of general deterrence, but some of his surrogates have suggested that the United States might also be more forward in certain areas. Curiously, and no one has made any mention of this at all, I think one of the places to watch in terms of a Trump foreign policy is Afghanistan, of all places. Because as you may or may not remember, at the end of last year, President Obama committed to leaving about 8,500 American forces in Afghanistan. And it's certainly seen as a kind of test of whether the strategy of disengagement would be pursued under a Trump presidency, or whether those kinds of commitments will be sustained. And certainly Asia and South Asia in particular are looking very closely at what might happen in Afghanistan, which the American public has generally forgotten. Everyone's focused on Syria. Let me say something very quickly about the claims with respect to trade. I think everyone knows that President Obama basically pulled the plug on TPP 2 weeks ago as it became clear that following the election that there'd be no support for it going forward on the Hill. I personally think that this is unfortunate, but the Democratic Party, neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party was supportive of this particular action. Ironically, I think it's going to leave the field of trade policy in East Asia significantly the Chinese. And again, ironically, because as we saw from President Xi's statements at the APEC summit, China is quite willing to lead on this issue and has its own trade initiative for East Asia, which is already in place, the so-called RCEP. So the loss of the TPP raises a whole series of issues about American credibility in Asia and with respect to the world economy more generally, regardless of what you think of the particularities of that agreement. Now, the question is, what will Mr. Trump actually do on trade policy? And here, again, there's been some walking back from some of the more extreme actions. Again, this is a sort of technical point, but it makes no sense right now to declare China currency manipulator because the currency is appreciating, not depreciating. And it makes no sense to talk about across the board 45% tariffs either, because I think everyone knows that that would be disastrous for the US economy. But the big questions, I think, are things like NAFTA. What does it mean to renegotiate NAFTA or tear NAFTA up? This is an agreement which has basically become the institutional foundations for several key industries in the United States, most notably the automobile industry. But even within San Diego, industries such as aerospace depend very heavily on the integration which is provided by the NAFTA. And so the question of what it would mean to rip that up or perfect it, I mean, I was talking with a colleague earlier today, and we were speculating that, in fact, this idea of renegotiating the NAFTA may actually push in the direction of deepening the NAFTA, because it's not clear how you would renegotiate the NAFTA to impose higher tariffs between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So I suspect on the trade front that probably what we'll see are some enforcement actions with respect to trade with China, countervailing duties dumping, for example, in an industry such as steel, which, again, ironically, is very similar to what Secretary Clinton actually promised to do prior to the election. So I'll stop there and leave it to the others on foreign policy.
Thank you very much.